Hello everyone, welcome to NSLI Interactive's first virtual event of the 2020-2021 academic year, entitled Beyond the Classroom, Learning Languages Abroad. My name is Alexander, and I work for the NSLI team at IRN USA. My colleagues Ligaya and Kyle will be helping out with this event as well. Thank you so much for joining. Let's start by quickly going over some functions in Zoom and the outline for the event. Make sure to rename yourself so only your first name appears. This is just for privacy reasons. And also please make sure that you're muted while the presenters or a fellow attendee is speaking. Video is optional during these presentations, so feel free to have it on or off. The event will begin with 4 presentations from each of our speakers, and then we're going to be moving into breakout rooms for a Q&A session with 1 panelist in each room. During this time, we encourage the participants to turn on their video and to unmute themselves in order to interact with the guest speakers. Finally, we will all return to the main room to conclude the event. Next slide, please. Before our speakers present, I want to give some background information for anyone not familiar with the program. The National Language Security Initiative for Youth, NSLI, is a program of the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs. Every year, NSLI brings about 600 students abroad to learn critical languages like Arabic, Chinese, Hindi, Indonesian, Korean, Russian, Turkish, and Persian. And NSLI has a lifelong impact as the students immerse themselves in the local culture, practices and diplomacy, and work to become experts in their language. And the speakers today are going to be speaking to that. And before I do introduce the speakers, I would like to ask those in the audience who are prospective applicants to the NSLI program to share what NSLI language are you interested in studying. Please write in the chat rather than aloud. And if there are any current students or alumni here, feel free to write in the chat the languages you studied with NSLI or are currently studying. And anyone else who is neither a prospective student nor an alumni, feel free to just write what languages you might have studied before in your life. Oh, wow, okay. This is going really fast now. I'm seeing a lot of Korean, some Arabic, Russian. Someone who studied Arabic with virtual NSLI, Chinese. All right, so it sounds like we have a lot of Hindi, Chinese in Taiwan. We got some virtual summer intensive alumni here. Okay, so we've got a great variety. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And now I will like to introduce the speakers. So today we're going to be hearing from 4 NSLI alumni, one of whom is also a current student, and they come from different NSLI programs. First, Amanda is an alum of NSLI's 2019 Korean Summer Program and a current NSLI 2020-2021 Korean Academic Year student. She recently graduated from high school and will attend college next year. Though she is not set on a profession, she hopes to use her desire to help others and her language skills in a future job. Shreya is the 2019-2020 Dallas NSLI alumni representative and an alum of NSLI's 2018 Korean Summer Program. Following her NSLI experience, she became a passionate advocate of study abroad programs and cross-cultural exchange. In her free time, she likes to study languages and has most recently taken up Mandarin Chinese. Tristan is a freshman political science major at the University of Louisville and an alum of NSLI's 2019 Indonesian Summer Program. Tristan plans on continuing his language studies through college study abroad programs and hopes to one day work as a foreign service officer. Tejas is a high school senior in Richmond, Virginia, and an alum of NSLI's 2018 Turkish Summer Program. In his free time, he loves to watch TV, volunteer for political campaigns, and learn languages. So after we hear from the speakers, we are going to be putting you into breakout rooms with one of the panelists for an interactive Q&A session for you to all ask questions. Following the Q&A breakout room, we will return to the main room in order to conclude the event. I want to note that for those who could not join us live today, we are recording this webinar and we'll post it on our NSLI Interactive website, so feel free to tell your friends afterwards that it will be there. But now, without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers for their presentations, and we're going to be starting with Amanda, who is going to be discussing how one can use daily habits to enhance their language learning while abroad. Next slide, please.
Hi, thank you everyone. I'm Amanda and I am a Seoul alumni from 2019 summer and a current academic student also for Korea. And today I'm going to be talking about making and modifying your daily habits outside of the classroom. Next slide, please. So the first one is modifying your cell phone usage. It definitely seems like something kind of minuscule, but you'd be surprised how much you check your phone throughout the day. So one easy, sure way to do that is to change your phone settings to your target language. That way, even if you take a quick glance, you'll automatically see some new vocab words, that kind of thing. It may seem kind of hard at first, but your muscle memory should be able to help you get half of the way there. And then you can always look something up if you don't know. Limiting social media consumption is also a big deal because many of you guys probably have friends on social media that are from the US or are English speakers, so you kind of want to limit your exposure to English while you're working on your target language. So limiting social media consumption is really important, and there's so many things to take in and experience that it's definitely easier than it sounds. Another important thing is to schedule when to communicate with your family back home. If you were to go through NSLI, I think it's important to schedule with your family before you leave. That way you guys already have a sure way that you guys are going to communicate, and that way you're not switching back into English all the time. And I think I only called my mom once on program, and we didn't even text every day, so you can definitely limit it like that if you need to, but it also will help you immerse yourself in the culture and who you're around and all those kinds of things. Another thing is, instead of looking something up on your phone, you can always ask someone for help. Maybe find a local, or like in Seoul, like in the picture, there was people that wore red hats, and you could go up to them and ask them questions on where something was or how to get somewhere or for recommendations. They're super kind, and it was actually our homework a lot to talk to these people. And yeah. And another thing is, if you're going to like a restaurant or you need a recommendation for something, it is also good to ask like the waiter, even if like you know what you want to eat. It can just help you push a little bit further into your language learning by trying to ask someone. It helps practical communication and real life examples. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The next thing is journaling, and this was one of my favorite ways to keep up with the language learning outside of the classroom. And the number one way that I did it was journaling in my target language. And this is about, you can write about your surroundings, what you learned in class, maybe if you're with the host family, how your host family was, a new tea shop you tried out. It's great for language recall because you have to hear a word about 6 times before you really remember it. And so if you'd seen words throughout the day and you really apply it to your journal, it's great for language recall. And then when you go back and read it, it's even better. I think it's really important to set a time to schedule or a time to journal. That way you keep on a consistent schedule and you don't forget. And it's also a fun memory to keep. So not only does it help you with language learning, but you can look back on it. So you can add receipts or tickets or those kinds of things. I know I'd always add little bingsu. Bingsu is a Korean dessert, and I'd always add like the little sign of the bingsu in my journal. And also a little vocab notebook may be really useful. That way, while you're walking out on the street and you see words that you don't know, you can write down the vocabulary and look it up later. This is also good for recall. And this is an extra tip. As someone on the AY program, right now, since we aren't able to be in our host countries, instead of using a dictionary or a translation app, I use the Korean dictionary. That way I'm getting more Korean practice, and it can also help you explain around things. So if you don't know the word for something, maybe you've read so many definitions that you can kind of explain around what word you're looking for. Next slide, please. And scheduling is the most important thing. Time flies by so fast, and I was only there for 6 weeks. And I definitely think that there are so many small pieces of personal study time that you can find throughout your day. Subway rides was definitely the time I spent, like the most time I'd spent studying for my vocab quizzes was on subway rides. And you can make Quizlets and watch the daily news in your target language. Also listening to the news or listening to music in your target language. Those small changes can really help. And also with my friends in cohort, you may want to switch into English because if it is your first language, it's also natural. We're speaking it all the time. But it's really essential that you try to keep that communication in your target language. So maybe play a game, talk about what you learned in class. Me and my friends would always play Pictionary, with vocab words that we had a test on the next day. And that was a fun way to be able to keep the friendly atmosphere, but also be studying. And while you're walking around, keep that vocab notebook. And taking advantage of time with your host family is definitely super important. Even cleaning together, you can learn something new. I know I played Uno with my host family, and we were talking about the colors of the cards, and noransek is yellow, and choroksek is green. And I made up a color, and I said noroksek. So it was very embarrassing. But even that small little mistake in spending time with my host family, I don't think I'll ever forget yellow or green, which are those colors respectively, ever again because of those little mistakes. But that's natural and something that will be easier along the way. And that's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And now we're going to have Shreya present on leveraging the host family experience in order to improve one's language skills while on NSLI. So Shreya, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Shreya, and I'm also an alumna of the Korean Summer Program. I went in 2018, and then afterwards, I became a NSLI alumni representative for the Dallas region. And so today, I wanted to talk to you guys about one of the many ways you can go about practicing your target language outside of the classroom, which is by speaking with your host family. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and get started. So first I wanted to establish the importance of talking with your host family in the first place. So obviously one of the most important parts of the NSLI experience is that you'll be with your classmates and you're in your classroom studying for several hours, 5 days a week. And so that's like the book I used during the Korean summer program. And but you're taking in so much grammar and so much vocabulary that it can be a little bit a lot, a little bit much. And so one really cool thing is that you can go home and just reinforce all the information you've learned in a real setting, in a real conversation, but it's a very low stakes kind of supportive environment just because as in comparison to situations where you'd have to be outside of the house, either buying something or ordering something at a restaurant, those are very useful experiences, but you kind of want your Korean or whatever target language to be understood, I guess, immediately. But when you're with your host family, that kind of pressure is a lot less. Also, I found that conversations in the classroom often take place within the boundaries of a syllabus or a textbook. And so most of the conversations you'll have in the class will be for the purpose of, reviewing those concepts. But when you're talking with your host family, you're bound to just learn things spontaneously because obviously new things will always be coming up. And so it's not as, I guess, rigid. And I found it was a way to learn a lot of things that you just couldn't come across in the classroom. Next slide, please. Next, I wanted to talk about functioning in your target language. So Amanda kind of brought this up already, but definitely try not to use English as a crutch. If you have the option of speaking Konglish, which is Korean and English mixed together, or really any mix of a target language and English, the temptation to do so will be really, really strong just because that's what you're comfortable with. And there's also, with a lot of students, and I myself included, this kind of anxiety about not being understood when you try and say something, and about what you'll do when they don't understand you. But it's not a crisis, so definitely don't panic when this happens. And instead of just falling back to English immediately, a really good thing to do is, like Amanda said, working around that word or around that concept in simpler words. So you're still using your target language and still engaging as much as possible. And then in the process, usually your host family member will kind of pick up on what you're getting at, and they'll just kind of teach you a new word in the process. So it is a learning experience. And you're also much more likely to be appreciated when you try and speak in your host target language as opposed to just reverting to English. So definitely at least make the effort to do that, and don't be afraid of being kind of vulnerable. I think that's a really important part of improving. And so also, don't be afraid to ask questions when you don't know how to say something, or when you really just don't understand what's going on in the conversation. I had a really bad habit of just kind of smiling and nodding when I didn't know what was going on, because I didn't want to disrupt the flow of the conversation. I thought that would be really rude, and that it would just kind of slow everyone down. But everyone is there to kind of help you grow, especially your host family, because they were, you know, open-minded enough to invite a complete stranger into their home. So they're also really like helpful when you make mistakes or when you're trying to learn something. So don't be afraid when you're just totally lost. Just go ahead and ask, because that's going to help you a lot more in the long run. And also, when you try and pretend to know something, it usually does catch up with you later, just because as the conversation goes on, you'll find that you're even more lost. So just, yeah, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk about one of the many things, some of the many things you can discuss with your host family. So conversations with my host family that were most interesting typically involved us kind of teaching each other something about our respective cultures or our countries. And so with my host father, he was actually, both of my host parents were from Busan, which is a place in Korea that does not use standard Seoul dialect. And so he would often use these words that were totally not taught in the classroom because they're not part of standard Korean, or he would pronounce them in a really interesting way. And so those conversations were just really great opportunities for me to learn something totally new that is really, really difficult to learn in a classroom setting or even by yourself. And so those can be fun opportunities. Also, tongue twisters is a really big one, because this is also it can function as a little bit of an icebreaker when you guys don't know each other too well. If you're teaching each other these tongue twisters that, you know, you're bound to like pronounce a little bit differently, and so you can kind of like laugh at your shared kind of difficulty with those. So that was definitely a really like nice memory for me, just chatting with my host parents over these two things. And then also, just because your host family are most likely the native speakers you'll spend the most amount of time with, it's a really, really great opportunity to develop your cultural knowledge in tandem with your language knowledge. So take advantage of these conversations and really ask about any variety of things. I really learned, I think, the most during my time in Korea from my host parents, because I spent so much time just discussing parts of our cultures and also kind of sharing with them my experiences from the US as well. And also other things you can talk about are traditions and customs or trends and pop culture, like things you see in the news, current events, and also your hobbies. So yeah, that's about that. Next slide, please. And then lastly, I just kind of wanted to touch on the importance of making time to spend with your host family. So the NSLI experience is very, very packed, and there were often days where I was constantly on the move and I didn't really have time to sit down and relax. But in the midst of that, I think it's really vital that you make space in your day to sit down with your host family and just chat for a little bit, not only to practice your language skills, but to develop a bond that lasts much longer than the duration of the program. And I think that initial effort that I put in during program, talking with my host family every single day, is what really made it count, because now I still talk with my host family all the time. We keep each other updated on our lives, and I don't think that would have happened if I just treated their home as a place to come back every day. And so identify the free time in your schedule and also your host parents' schedule or your host family. My host family, both of my parents were nurses, and so they worked really long shifts or sometimes night shifts. And so I recognized that every day, if everyone was back in the house by 6 o'clock, we'd be able to have dinner together. And although sometimes this meant like at the end of the school day, I would have to make a decision between going home or going out with some friends, I would often make that decision to just go straight home, because I knew that I wanted to prioritize those moments with them. So yeah, that is about all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shreya. That was a great presentation on the impact of the host family experience during NSLI programs. And now we're going to hear about interacting with one's community at large while abroad in order to advance one's language skills from Tristan.
We good to move on to that next slide? The beginning of mine should be next. Oh, can you go back one if possible? Oh, I guess, okay. Sorry about that. So anyways, hello everyone. My name is Tristan. Like Alexander said in the introductions, I'm a freshman political science major at the University of Louisville. And more importantly, I'm a proud alumni of the 2019 Indonesian Summer Language Program. And that took place in Jakarta, Indonesia. And in such a large city, Jakarta is, I believe, the third or fourth largest city, depending on what metric you use to measure it in the entire world. And so with that, there's a lot of opportunities for community engagement and conversations outside both the classroom and outside your host family's house that really challenge you to sort of develop your NSLI language skills. And so you can go ahead, that next slide. And so, like I said, when it comes to language learning outside the classroom, one of the most common and essential ways to improve is to use your target language out in the community. And depending on what city that your target program language takes place in, there's a lot of different opportunities, whether it be street markets that are open air, large malls, barber shops, bargaining opportunities, etc. You're able to refine your language skills outside the structure and safety net that's afforded by the classroom. You see, while it's, of course, extremely important to learn the dictionary definition of words and the proper grammar that you get from the classroom setting, it's pivotal to also gain practical skills by exposing yourself to the slang and vernacular that native speakers out in the community and on the streets. If you could think of an example domestically, people who are learning English might have a great grasp of the dictionary, but if you drop them in the middle of New York City or somewhere down south, the slang there is almost indecipherable to someone who's learning English. And the same is true for us American students pursuing a NSLI target language. So like I said, for me personally, being in a city as large as Jakarta, there was no shortage of activities that really challenged me to use Bahasa, which is the Indonesian language. And the main avenue for doing that was actually through a rideshare service in Jakarta called Gojek. It's basically Indonesian Uber, where you can hail either a motorbike or a car to take you from one destination to another within the city. And since there's so many people trying to use the service at any given time, there's a chat function within the app that allows you to describe your location and your appearance to the Gojek driver. That way, whenever they pull up on, the side of a busy sidewalk, they can identify which pedestrian is you. And so most of the drivers, unfortunately are lower income or either didn't have access to education for one reason or another. And so a lot of them don't know much, if any, English. And even their Indonesian is extremely abbreviated and incorporates a lot of different slang words. And so at first, all of us NSLI students were easy to spot in a crowd because one, our appearance, and then two, our usage of extremely formal grammar and descriptions within the chat function. And so the drivers usually found it funny and entertaining to communicate with us foreigners. But later on the program, myself and a few of the other students in Jakarta made it a point to try and adopt some of the slang that we had learned from those drivers in order to communicate more seamlessly and sort of try and blend in with the rest of the people on the streets, which was really enjoyable. Next slide, please. And so one driver in particular became a really integral part of my host family experience. So my host family was actually fortunate enough to have a personal driver. His name was Alvar. And he and I actually drove together to and from school every day. He drove me there. And with the traffic in Jakarta, we spent about 2.5 hours together every single day that I was on program. And so communicating with Alvar was a great way to practice in an environment without judgment, because he wasn't gonna diss on me if I made a mistake in terms of pronunciation, and I'd check my homework assignments with him, read him the essays I'd written the night before, things of that nature. And that's one of the best perks of using your language out in public, is you don't have some of the pressure and the embarrassment that might come up if you make a mistake in class. You don't want to let down your teachers. Your buddy might, make a comment outside of class. And in general, NSLI classrooms are very supportive, and students really try and support and uplift one another, but there's still sort of that human tendency to not want to make a mistake in front of your buddies and peers. But if you're out in the streets talking with a driver or a shopkeeper, someone who's more or less a stranger, there's a lot less pressure and not as many stakes surrounding the conversation. So they might ask you to clarify what you say if you do make a mistake or there's a lapse in communication understanding, but there's no embarrassment that comes with that. Most natives don't really expect you to know any of their language because a lot of tourists and travelers, unfortunately, don't take the time to learn any greetings outside what you might get in a basic guidebook. So the fact that you're even trying to communicate with people in public in their native tongue, that gives them a sense of assurance, and they're usually impressed with that. And that in turn gives you a sense of confidence in your language capabilities, and that enhances both your language skills and just the overall quality of the conversation. Next slide, please. And so another method to enhance your language learning out in the community is a pretty obvious one that a lot of people I really encourage to take advantage of, and that's bargaining in markets and shops. And so like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, depending on where your target language is being taught and what city you're in, you're going to have different access to different kinds of marketplaces. So some might be open air, a bit more rudimentary, a lot of fruit markets, vegetable stands, things of that nature. Other people in more developed cities, whether it's Jakarta or Moscow, Seoul, you might find yourself in more developed malls and stuff. But regardless of where you're walking or where you're doing your shopping, there's a high likelihood that you're going to have native speakers and native people working in those stores and stuff. And so a great way to enhance your language learning and learn a lot of new terminology is to look at the tags on whether it's clothes or look at the prices on fruit. Bargaining for a bushel of bananas or a crate of apples for my host mom was a great way to sort of learn the prices and in turn sort of help memorize some of the larger numbers. Depending on the currency that's being used in your host country, there's probably different numbers that go into it. Indonesia uses the thousands and tens of thousands for their bills. And so I wouldn't have any exposure to know how to say 20,000, for example. 23 for example, is like 23,000. There's no way I would know that if I didn't have to go out and buy a shirt that costs that much or food that costs about that much. So that's a great way to really challenge yourself and in turn get a lot of new language, vocabulary words under your belt, so to speak. Next slide, please. And so one particularly fun way to really improve your language learning outside the class is to communicate with younger folks, whether that's younger children that might be host siblings or people in your neighborhood that you encounter on the streets, or it might be older teenagers who are middle or high school students, maybe even college level, just sort of that younger generation. It's sort of a ubiquitous thing, whether you're talking about the United States or a foreign country where a NSLI program's taking place. Kids use a different kind of slang than their adult counterparts do. It's just a tendency of people, that are on social media to abbreviate words, shorten things down. And there's a lot of different slang that you can learn from kids. And one thing in particular that I learned from some of these students right here are the different honorifics that are used to speak to elders. And so Indonesia, if anyone has a knowledge of that, is a huge archipelago. It's the largest island chain in the world, and it's such a wide margin, it's not even close. And so depending on what region and what island that you're on, different honorifics are used to address older men or older women, teachers, parents, relatives, things of that nature. And so we were doing some volunteer work at this orphanage in Jakarta, and some of these students were calling me Mas Tristan, which actually translates to Brother Tristan, and it's sort of used colloquially as like a big brother terminology. And so I came back to my host family and I was talking to my older host brother and I was like, Mas Gaza. He sort of looked at me and laughed like quizzically. He was like, Tristan, where did you learn the word Mas? And I was like, oh, like these kids were calling me this at the orphanage that we were volunteering at the other day. And he was like, well, they sort of taught you right, but I forgot to think that my host dad and in turn my host brother, they're actually from an area of Indonesia called Sunda. And so in Sunda, there's a different honorific that's used for older men or brother figures, and that's abang. And so my host brother was like, Tristan, if you're going to say that and you're going to try and call me bro or whatever, just say abang Gaza as opposed to mas. And so if it hadn't been for those kids and the conversation that they struck up with me, I might have went along and been using the wrong honorific, might have embarrassed myself. And even though I tripped it with my host brother that initial time, it was a good way to sort of, check myself and learn some things I wouldn't have otherwise encountered. And even if you're picking these things up from younger kids, there's oftentimes opportunities to use it in the classroom. And that's a great way to gain clout and sort of impress your teachers in the classroom by using some of these more colloquial terms, slang that they really don't expect students that are so new to the language to know. And so really going out in the community and challenging yourself, it's a great way to enhance both the language and cultural experience. So I really encourage you guys to get out on the streets wherever your program's taking place. Thank you, guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tristan, for that great presentation. I agree with you. It's so important to get out in the community when you're trying to learn a language, and that's something that NSLI enables because you're immersed in that environment. Next, we have Tejas, who is going to discuss learning language through being a citizen ambassador. Go ahead, Tejas.
You can move on to the next slide. So, hi, my name is Tejas. I am a senior in Richmond, Virginia. A high school senior, and in the summer of 2019, I was lucky enough to study Turkish in Bursa, Turkey, which are the beautiful pictures you see here. So just to set the scene for being a citizen ambassador, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means in a second. Bursa, I like to think of it as a city of division. And a lot of cities that you might travel to in the NSLIY program are like this, where on the left you see a super busy, modern, bustling city filled with people who want to learn English desperately. But on the right side, you see a historic monument called Kozahan, which is one of the world's oldest silk markets. You see there a sort of relic of the past. And I think that's sort of what NSLI represents to me, because on the one hand, you're learning skills that'll propel you into the future and into the modern globe that we're facing. But most NSLI countries, if not all, will have some sort of cultural component where you are tied to the culture and you're learning about the past and the history of your NSLI target language. And so with that setting the scenes, I would like to talk a little bit more about different venues where I learned to be a citizen ambassador. So next slide, please. So first, I'll define what a citizen ambassador is. Basically, this is a term if you do go on a NSLI trip, I guess. That's a term that you'll hear a lot, is the term of a citizen ambassador, and essentially means that you're kind of like an ambassador of the U.S. You're someone who's representing the U.S. to people who live in the host country that you're going to. So in this case, in my NSLI Turkish adventures, one of the biggest things that I'm really, really grateful for is cultural excursions. And so on the left, we met with the Minister of Education in Bursa, Turkey. And we were basically talking about the American school system and the Turkish school system and how those two were essentially the two most different things you could get. And to me, that sort of first represented my first foray into being a citizen ambassador, because on the far left, you see the Minister of Education who only spoke Turkish. So it was a little bit difficult trying to traverse that. But he really wanted to know what our conceptions of the American school system were, how we would improve our own school system. And you know, he wanted to know what he could learn from America to bring over to Turkey. And I thought that was really, really interesting because it really showed how much power you have as a NSLI student, as opposed to just, you know, a high schooler going off to a random country to learn a language. You're really representing your country, sometimes even to incredibly powerful people. On the right was another sort of example of me being a citizen ambassador along with other members of my NSLI cohort. That is a English classroom, which was located directly underneath our Turkish classroom. And so you can see a bunch of little Turkish kids there learning English, and the English teacher there would bring students from our classroom to talk a little bit about America, to teach the kids English. And I thought that was really, really interesting as well, because it sort of shows, like, a lot of these kids, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but a lot of these kids had so many misconceptions of the US, and to be able to dispel those misconceptions and sort of talk with them as a peer about what you know, our country was really about was really, really interesting. Next slide, please. One of the biggest things that exists in pretty much any NSLI program is the idea of conversation partners, who are essentially people that you talk to on a more informal level. Most NSLI programs are made up of classes. You have classes anywhere from 4 to 6 hours a day on the weekdays. But in addition to that, most NSLI programs have conversation partners, which allow you to put your language skills that you learned in the classroom to use. So in this case, basically everybody on our program had a host sibling, and so we would all get together, the NSLI students and the host siblings, and we basically do activities where we would speak Turkish, apply skills, and that was also really engaging because you know, they were people who were exactly my age, and most of them spoke really, really good English, to be fair, but it was still really exciting to, you know, find bonds over, you know, K-pop or famous actors or awesome TV shows among people who were halfway across the world. And so that's why I really, really enjoyed conversation partners. And I thought that was really an integral part of my NSLI journey as well. Next slide, please. So this was one of the most interesting parts of my NSLI stay, I would say, is dealing with cultural misconceptions, because my host family would take me all the time to their old village in sort of the outskirts of Bursa, probably like an hour away. And, Bursa is a pretty like cosmopolitan city. It has not too many foreigners, I would say, but people who live in Bursa are oftentimes exposed to people from different countries. But in my host family's small village, very few tourists visited. And so they often had a lot of misconceptions about the US that were formed predominantly from what they saw on TV, what they saw in the news. And so oftentimes when I would go up and meet my host family's cousins, for example, they would always ask me about the US, they'd always ask me about politics, and one of the biggest things they asked me for some reason was about French fries and fast food. I remember the first day I came back, or I came to Turkey and went to my host family's house. Instead of, having platters of Turkish food like I was expecting, they bought American food from the local McDonald's, and they bought French fries and milkshakes and things like that. And I was sort of taken aback, but they were doing it out of kindness. They wanted to make me feel at home, even though I really don't eat fast food here in the US. And I thought that was really interesting, because I had to tell them, no, not everybody eats fast food in the US. We eat other things too. But those cultural misconceptions, I think, are things that lead to bigger misconceptions between countries. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that when you are, going to your host country in NSLI, you are repairing relationships that may end up repairing relationships between your two countries. That's the purpose of NSLI, after all, is to ensure that, to ensure greater relations between countries or the US and critical language countries around the world. And I think the fact that we as high schoolers get to play even just a small part of that is really, really engaging and exciting. Next slide, please. So last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about keeping track of my language learning, sort of through being a citizen ambassador. So based on my conversations with my conversation partners, or during the cultural excursions that I went on, I would learn so many different vocab words, so many different grammar concepts that I wouldn't have learned inside the classroom. For example, on that visit with the Minister of Education, I learned way too many education-related vocab words that I just immediately wrote down in a notebook. And like Amanda, Shreya, and Tristan have talked about before, having a notebook or having some sort of compendium where you can put all your vocab words in like one place is really, really critical, because for me, and like a lot of NSLI alumni will tell you, the first month after you come back from your NSLI program, you start losing your language, just because you're immersed in English again. You probably aren't using Turkish or Korean or Persian in your daily life here in the States. But for me, having that little notebook in my back pocket was really useful back here, because this past summer, because of quarantine, I was really, really looking forward to relearning Turkish, and opening that textbook or opening that notebook, having a list of vocab words that I already had written was really, really helpful, because I was able to connect the context of the words with the words themselves, and that was a really good way to reinvigorate my Turkish learning. And just Quizlet's just another app I use, whatever works for you, but I think always having your eyes and ears open and always constantly learning throughout your 6 weeks. And like others have said, those 6 weeks will fly by so quickly. So when you're there, try to be present and make sure you're always listening or looking for good vocab words to improve your mastery of whatever language you're learning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tejas, and thank you to all the presenters. We're going to be moving on to the next part of the event now, which is the Q&A session. We're going to be moving you all into breakout rooms. There's going to be 4 breakout rooms, 1 for each panelist. And during this time, we encourage you to turn on your videos and unmute yourselves in order to interact with the panelists. You can ask any question related to their presentation, but also to NSLI in general, about language learning strategies, about living abroad. For instance, you might want to ask students how they saw themselves improve in communication skills over the course of the program, or maybe how did they get over their shyness in speaking with their host family or people in their community. And when we come back, I want to ask someone from each group to share what they discussed in their breakout room. So I'm going to be moving you into that breakout room now, and it's going to happen automatically. I think everyone should be back now. I hope everyone had some fruitful discussions. I jumped into all the rooms at different points and seemed like there was a lot of great discussion happening, and probably that the discussion could have gone on for much longer. So I hope it will continue in some form after this event. I'm curious if anyone from any of the rooms can share something that they discussed, whether it's an attendee or a panelist. I know there's a lot of us here, but feel free to unmute yourself and share. And you can use the raise hand function maybe if that feels more comfortable. Or type in the chat as well, any manner, so that people who weren't in your breakout room can hear what happened.
Well, in our breakout room, I actually asked a question on how to combat anxiety when first landing and getting used to your surroundings. And Tristan talked about, you know, just getting out of your comfort zone, and the more mistakes you make, the more it'll first force you to like learn about those things. And I think that that's really important to know.
Awesome, thank you for sharing. I agree, totally.
You're welcome.
Okay, looks like we have a comment from Pooja. I hope I'm saying that right. I loved learning about Tejas's defining movement while on the program. Okay, cryptic, but sounds really exciting. Does anyone else like to share? Okay, looks like Tristan has put up his Instagram in case anyone has any more questions. Thank you, Tristan. I think then we can move to the next slide and start to conclude the event. So I just want everyone to know about some NSLI resources. First of all, to know that the application deadline for the 2021-22 programs is November 5th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So for prospective applicants, obviously a very important date to remember, and we hope that you apply. If you're interested in any more information on the NSLI program and application, please go to nsliforyouth.org. And to read any student alumni stories about NSLI, please visit nsliinteractive.org. I see that someone asked about when this webinar will be posted on the website. I'm hopeful that it will be tomorrow, but potentially might be one day more. But it will be up there quite soon. And we would love for you to share it out with any of your friends or family or anyone who might be interested in NSLI. But these 2 websites are really great for finding out more about the program, and NSLI Interactive, especially if you want to hear more about stories from alumni and students themselves. I'm going to ask for one more thing before everyone goes. I know no one might love doing this, but we do have a post-event survey, and it's to help us make better events for you guys. It will only take 1 minute or 2 minutes tops, I think. I'm going to get the link here, and we will probably also send it out by email. But if you want to just do it now while you're in the mindset of this virtual event, that would be amazing. I promise it will only take a minute or 2. And before we go, I really want to say thank you so much to everyone for attending and joining on a Tuesday night, and especially to our giving so much time and effort and energy in preparing their presentations and then giving such great ones, and for all their advice. So thank you again. I'm going to put the link again because it's getting buried in thank yous, which I appreciate. And thank you so much for coming, and please stay connected with us. Goodbye, all.
Thank you so much.